Alright, let's do this one more time. I don't think there's a more fitting way to end off a difficult year than by talking about how bad this year has been for video games. I know it always puts a smile on my face as I slowly realise that time may pass and mistakes may be made, but developers and publishers will always do stupid things with video games. It certainly makes my job a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah, but was 2020 notably worse for video games than previous years? Honestly, not really, but if you're already disappointed because you can't see your family or because someone's bought all the toilet paper, then you're likely to react negatively while you finally sit down to play a game you've been looking forward to for a while, and actually, it's the worst thing ever. If there was one defining characteristic of the last 12 months, it'll be the delays that were inflicted on numerous games out there that weren't able to get everything together in time. But then there's the games that could have used some more time in the oven, released too soon with far too many glitches to justify charging money for the privilege. How many times have we seen that over the past couple of years? Every time I make this video, there's always this weirdly chill vibe around it. I'll talk about the best video games of the year and everyone's at each other's throats for giving supposedly unwarranted praise to a mediocre pile of crap. But here, on a video where I'm a lot more negative and have a lot more criticism to hand out, everyone's just here for the ride. Is that an acceptance that bad games are simply a part of life now? Are we so comfortable with the idea that we look at a video like this as an opportunity to hurl abuse at bad games and dogpile on some already unfortunate releases? Well, I'm not going to stop anyone, since I think we need something like this after the year we've all had. Think of it as some kind of therapy. Alright, so before we get into anything too exciting, I need to play something for you real quick from last year's video.
There's always a game made every year that for some reason is surprisingly glitchy, barely held together by half a line of code, and usually by a studio that should know a lot better. This year it was, WWE 2K20. Who knows what it's gonna be in 2020? If it's Cyberpunk, I'll be a little bit sad.
Whoops! Despite what the naive 2019 version of me might be saying, I truly didn't expect to be talking about Cyberpunk 2077 on a Worst Games of the Year video. To be honest, I feel like it's a tricky game to judge, since when played as part of the next-gen experience that it claims to be, on next-gen consoles that can handle all of its social commentary and Keanu Reeves' incredible raw magnetism, you've got a hell of a game here. Main missions are a bit stuffy and it'd benefit a lot from more of a sandbox style to it, but it ain't half bad really. Sadly, all of the crunch time in the world isn't enough to save Cyberpunk's shockingly awful optimization for last-gen consoles, with the PS4 and Xbox One versions being nigh on unplayable at times. And considering that it was advertised to be playable on these consoles, that's something I can't ignore. I appreciate that CD Projekt Red are trying to fix this game, but the fact that Cyberpunk 2077 was shipped in this state is genuinely more than a bit manipulative on their part. I get they were running out of time, all the apologies on Twitter are a testament to that, but if you're having this many issues with older consoles, then you need to do a delay of some kind. Delaying the whole game again might have been too much, but with short supplies of PS5s and Xbox Series X's out there, a delay for older consoles may have left CDPR with some rough sales figures at launch. And failing that, you just get Sony removing Cyberpunk from the PlayStation Store and offering refunds to players who've already bought it, which doesn't happen often and is perhaps an indication that this is a bit of a fucking weird release. It's not an easy problem to fix, and I am sympathetic to a certain extent, but the reality is that one of the most highly anticipated games of the year is a buggy, glitchy monstrosity for most people out there, and that just can't fly these days. You could always get it for PC. Bad horror games really piss me off sometimes. It's the kind of genre that is easy to do well if you're willing to take the time to build atmosphere properly and respect the player's capacity to feel fear organically without the need for shitty jump scares, but at the same time, cutting corners and assuming that the player will fill in the gaps for you combine for a recipe for abject failure. Much like the one felt very closely with Outbreak: The New Nightmare. When I first heard about this game, I misread it as an Outlast game and thought that this was some kind of fixed camera spin-off more akin to classic Resident Evil, and hey, that's wrong, but also not completely. It's actually an indie game that tries to be Resident Evil but without any thought for why that game was so successful and terrifying. Yeah, okay, I'll buy into that. Not that I'd recommend you spend money on this, because I think calling it Outbreak and angling it to look like Resident Evil at first glance hints at some of the underhand tactics that seem to be bubbling away under the surface. It's not a good game, that's kind of why I'm talking about it right now, but it's the extent to which it tries to be like a more recognisable name, but without any of the charm or quiet qualities of the horror game that helped to launch an entire genre. Like, they tried to copy the fixed camera angles, but whereas Resi 1 was cunning with what the camera showed you to ramp up tension without being a dick about it, Outbreak throws you under a bus and makes it very hard to see what's chewing on your leg. It's also mind-numbingly repetitive, since most levels boil down to looking around for an important item needed for progression, and shooting zombies that stumble towards you. No puzzles though, because who plays horror games to do puzzles? You see, it's like Resident Evil 1, but they made it better. So you're saying it's more than a rip-off?
I'm never too sure how many of these kinds of indie games are maliciously made with the intent of deceiving, sleepwalking consumers who accidentally buy this kind of crap, or if they're really passionate indie devs who really like classic styles of video games but aren't quite able to replicate the style enough. But even without comparisons, it's a terrible video game and a terrible, terrible horror game. It needs more awkward voice acting, and then we might be in business.
Oh god, bad horror games again, why? It's like splitting hairs at times, deciding which shitty, not very scary game is better or worse than another, but if you accept from the start that these kind of games aren't gonna scare you through any intended legitimate means, then you start looking at other things like optimization and whether or not the game can be compared to any type of surgery. I'm not sure if there was something in the air this year besides a respiratory virus, but Dawn of Fear is scarily similar to Outbreak in how insultingly similar it is to classic Resident Evil, but with none of the below-the-surface quality. The comparisons are even closer here, with large parts of the trailer uploaded to the official PlayStation YouTube channel looking an awful lot like that game with zombie dogs and Jill sandwiches, so I think I see what you're doing. This is a great trailer, by the way, scored like a summer blockbuster, but with clips that aren't quite as exciting. Oh fuck, let's go! Except, nah, not really. I appreciate that the trailer doesn't do much to hide what the game is like, so long as you can look past the cinematic trailer music, because this is an incredibly stilted and awkward video game to play, but not in the typical horror way. Horror's a funny old genre where you can get away with impeding your character's movement or abilities because it adds to the tension, but Dawn of Fear is a little too distracting with the way that it glitches out and tanks its own frame rate whenever there's one too many zombies on screen. The frame drops are actually more dangerous than the zombies since crashes are frequent, but the zombies can barely touch you since your hitbox is tiny. This is a poor attempt at mirroring classic horror games from the 90s that relies more on a base level of nostalgia than being a decent way to spend an afternoon. It reminds you of something good, but that's not enough to move past its problems. I like the puzzles though. Just make a game full of those next time. I take a little pride in remembering certain game reveals. Not quite on the level of The Last Guardian when that finally got a proper trailer after seeing teasers years before the game was confirmed to be coming out, but when a game is revealed more as a proof of concept than anything else, as a sign that a game is being made here, or at least being worked on in some capacity, I like being able to remember that fact when we finally get some concrete news about it. At the start of 2017, Marvel's YouTube account, the one where all the film trailers go, posted a trailer for an upcoming Avengers Project game concept thing that was happening with Square Enix at the helm. No real details to speak of, but just trust us, this game is coming out at some point and you'll definitely hear more about it in the coming months and years. Well, years went past, and it took until E3 2019 for this game to poke its head above the water again, but in a post-Avengers Endgame world, now was the perfect time for this game. There is no possible way for anyone to screw this up.
I first realised that this game had screwed up when I looked at the cast of playable characters in the reveal trailer and didn't think, oh shit, they actually made that Avengers game, that's really cool. Because my first impression of all the playable characters was based on my film knowledge over the last decade. It's been ingrained into my mind so heavily that they just look a little bit strange to me. But that's okay, we got plenty of time for the game to turn it around and hopefully play really, really well. Yeah!
I wish this game was better than this, I really do. Believe me when I say I take no pleasure in the Avengers game being such an underwhelming waste of everyone's time and money, because I was reasonably excited to see what Square would do with the property, even if the character designs didn't fill me with confidence. The amount of time it took until any news came out about the game after that initial trailer perhaps indicates that there were issues behind the scenes over what kind of game needs to be made here, and following the showing at E3 2019 where it was mostly just cutscenes and not a ton of gameplay, there were concerns. These concerns were very justified as the game started to resemble the live service of Destiny, but coupled with unsatisfying combat laced with quick-time events and just a smattering of glitches and technical issues for good measure. Avengers didn't sell well, with Square Enix losing millions on the game, and considering the outstanding success that Insomniac had with Spider-Man, and continue to have to this day, this is even more disappointing. An Avengers video game released 1 year after an Avengers film became the highest grossing film of all time and has been the dominant force in pop culture for the last 10 years, it shouldn't be struggling for sales. How did you get it this wrong? I'm not the biggest fan of the Game Awards. I appreciate the widespread coverage it gets as a sort of Oscars for video games, but this celebration of gaming sometimes gets bogged down with what it's trying to be. I enjoy seeing new trailers, but with so many headlines being written during the show, it's easy for any announcement or award to be swamped by the big show-stopping news of the hour. Last year, the Game Awards closed out the show with a trailer for Fast and Furious Crossroads, which should be a fairly big deal considering it's directly based on a popular franchise of films, and yet, fortunately, it kinda got forgotten about between the Xbox Series X getting unveiled and Joker getting into Smash Bros. Talk about your happy accidents. I kinda like the idea of this game because Crossroads is a bit more than a simple racing game that tries to tie in elements from more action-y games to make some kind of hybrid, but in terms of execution, why did they even bother? Fast and Furious is all about those set pieces and exciting street races, and yet this game is so boring. Oh my god, it's the dullest thing in the world. How did they make a game about driving fast cars and stopping terrorists unbelievably tedious and look like it's some terrible offcut from the previous generation of games? I think the intention was to release this game in May, shortly after F9 came out in the theaters, but delays to both meant that Crossroads came out in August, awkwardly detached from the film, and unable to capitalize on any possible tie-in. Whether or not that allowed players to scrutinize the quality of the game harder than if we were distracted by a movie coming out too, but regardless, this is a rough car driving experience at the best of times. Any more tailing missions and I may end up asleep at the wheel. Just like the developers then. It does surprise me that more companies don't try to buy into Smash Bros. Obviously getting a character in the roster isn't like to happen to any studio that is willing to ask the right questions, but there aren't too many games out there that try to emulate Smash Bros' unique style of multiplayer combat. Granted, there have been similar games made in the past, like Sony's PlayStation All-Star Battle Royale that didn't go over too well, or smaller indie titles like Brawlhalla and Slap City that use the style without the massive playable roster, and while it's wise to avoid these comparisons, it does surprise me that more games don't try to latch onto a name as big as Smash Bros. Bounty Battle is one such game that can be used as a case study for why you shouldn't try to copy the Smash Bros formula, even if doing so with characters solely from indie games is actually an awesome idea. Just make sure you don't give yourself too much to do. Hype is one of the worst kind of diseases around because despite an incredible animated trailer that shows off characters from Guacamelee, Darkest Dungeon, Axiom Verge, Nuclear Throne, the fucking Owlboy from Owlboy, all of this means nothing if the game is a bunch of wank, and sadly, it's a lot of wank. Oh lord, just look at it. This looks like pre-alpha footage of a fighting game where movesets or animations haven't been finalized, and where the combat is floaty as hell and deeply unsatisfying. It looks like the first version of a fan game made with Flash, which almost makes sense considering the nature of Bounty Battle, but it's still a professionally made indie game that is using mascots from other indie games with way more effort put into them. And it's embarrassing seeing indie Smash Bros treated so poorly. Bounty Battle may well benefit from continued support and updates to claw back some kind of reputation moving forward, but the game we had in 2020 was pretty fucking appalling, and that's all I can judge for now. Wish I didn't have to. I was left very encouraged by the Final Fantasy VII Remake for being a shining example of what remakes can be if the developers are ambitious enough. Not everyone's going to have the backing of a company like Square and the budget to push the boat out and go wild with new concepts, but a remake can be more than just a process of updating a game to modern times. At the very least, it shouldn't be worse than the original, with the recent XIII Remake being so incredibly bad that it really calls into question the decision to revisit the game in the first place. Don't get me wrong, a remake to XIII that is respectable to the original game would be extremely welcome, since it ended on a cliffhanger and it'd be the next best thing to a sequel, but what we got this year is an absolute disgrace. And everybody knows it. Except maybe those poor souls who haven't experienced the original and their only exposure to XIII is a botched remake that throws everything that made the first game unique and interesting to play in the bin. The cel-shaded graphics that helped to make XIII feel so slick and stylish has been traded for this strange attempt at a semi-realistic redesign where all the characters have been remodeled to look like Fortnite characters, and yet the remake still wants to cling to the comic book style of the original with visual sound effects that now seem very out of place. They even reworked the cutscenes from being these high-energy sequences of comic panels to now feeling like something made in Gary's mod with ragdolls, and wow, this is awful. Oh my god. Why would you make a cult classic FPS from the early 2000s only to change so much of what made it so great? That's like repainting the Mona Lisa, but with rotted meat instead. You know things are bad when the people behind it come out and apologise for fucking things up so badly and have pledged to solve every issue with the glitches and broken frame rates. Nothing with the art style though, that's just gonna stay awful forever. Oh wow, it hurts to look at.
Every year, there's always a handful of easy targets when it comes to talking about the worst game of the year. There's some undercooked, low-budget indie games, there's some crappy shovelware, or, if you're feeling extra desperate, there's the well of yearly sports releases that are so hung up on sponsors and licenses that they fail to make any improvements of the last year, or really change anything, when last year they made a game. I don't really like games.
I say that, but I'm someone who frequently buys FIFA, so just know that I'm part of the problem too, but aware enough to recognise that fact. It could be worse though, because I could be part of the gang that parts with money to play Madden every year, which is the same kind of deal with the more American style of football that manages to fall into very similar issues as FIFA. That is, if you absolutely have to release one of these games at roughly the same time every year without fail, you're gonna start cutting corners. Innovation is pushed so far down on the list of priorities that you're more likely to see an impromptu musical number and all the players burst out into song. All this does is set expectations very low for every new Madden game, and yet somehow Madden NFL 2021 set new records for the lowest user score on Metacritic with a 0.2 out of 10, and shit, not even Cyberpunk went that low. Just how bad are we talking here? Hard to say how much of this feedback comes from a genuine place of hatred at the lack of quality in Madden 21, or if it's the overflowing of frustration at EA's complete reluctance to do anything interesting or even good with this franchise. But I do know that American football players shouldn't be moving like this, and the pitch shouldn't be blindingly white, and just, ow, is it so bad? How have EA managed to regurgitate a sports game with as little effort as possible and yet run afoul of so many glitches that fans campaigned on Twitter with a hashtag #NFLDropEA to get EA's exclusive license revoked? For a while it was thought that Madden 21 was so broken because EA were putting so much effort into all the new features in the next-gen version of the game, but then those came out and... oh... I can't wait until next year when EA demonstrates all that they've learned from this experience. They'll be calling the glitches surprise mechanics next, just you wait. It's safe to say that it's been a bad year for remakes. Minus Final Fantasy VII, of course, but frankly that game was a bit of a freak, and we likely won't see anything like it until the next episode comes out in a few years. For the rest of us mere mortals, we have to make do with Blizzard deciding to remake one of the most important RTS games of all time. Theoretically, that's a pretty good idea, since Warcraft as a franchise has come a long way since 2002, and it might be nice to remind the world what these games looked like before it became an MMO, but sadly, this is Blizzard we're talking about. The same guys who put Diablo on a phone and banned a streamer for supporting human rights protests in Hong Kong. You mean to say that Warcraft III Reforged is comfortably one of the worst remasters ever made? It sounds so obvious when you put it like that. The biggest difference between Reforged and something like the XIII Remake is how much Reforged was hyped and deemed necessary to be a thing that exists in the world. No one asked for 13 to be remade, but when Blizzard announced at 2018's BlizzCon that Reforged would have fully modelled characters and animations, and 4K resolution, suddenly we have expectations to manage. When Blizzard started promising improvements but delivered a far simpler and watered down video game full of connectivity issues, so you can't even access the crappy game you paid money for, it was an uphill struggle to convince people that Reforged was necessary. Some genius even tied Reforged and the original onto the same online infrastructure, so that the remaster being so bad and broken actually impacts on someone else's enjoyment of the original, since connecting just became a hell of a task. Also, since this is Blizzard in a post-Dota 2 world, the user agreement states that all custom content is Blizzard's property and that they can do what they like with it. So all in all, just summarising all that, it's a remaster that usually doesn't work. When it does work, they barely put any effort into it, and as soon as you start enjoying it, Blizzard have complete ownership of your custom content. Did you know that Diablo 2 will probably get a remaster at some point in the future? Oh god, make it stop. Oh boy, so where do we go from all of that? In recent years, I've found the worst game hasn't always been the one with the least redeeming features. There's some entertainment value to a glitchy, barely functional video game, and even though I can't say with any confidence that it's a shining example of a finished product, at least it's not deliberately manipulative with underhand tactics or filled with microtransactions. Or, as it turns out, a game that shatters the reputation of a well-respected franchise and was taken off sale mere hours after it was released. Cooking Mama Cookstar is far from the worst thing ever made from a technical standpoint, but from a legal one, oh man, it couldn't have been much worse. For all the reasons that a game is removed from sale, I never thought it'd be because of a breach of contract stating that the publisher Planet Entertainment had no right to use the Cooking Mama IP. It was on the Switch's eShop for a few hours until Office Create, the guys who own Cooking Mama, requested that the game be removed because of a legal dispute, and despite this, I think you can still purchase the game as a physical copy from numerous retailers, and it may have also gone back up on the eShop afterwards, I am not so sure. It's a wild video game because Planet Entertainment wanted the title on the PS4, on a non-Nintendo console for the first time in the franchise's history, and this kind of confidence in the product surely has to be based on its immense quality, right? Well no, it's not the worst game ever made, but it is dull as all hell and lacks a lot of the charm present in other video games, and when you factor in some imprecise motion controls and no meaningful progression from one recipe to the next, I don't know why they even bothered. How do you go into bat so hard for a game this lackluster with the threat of legal action hanging over your head? Would have probably been better off using all this energy for something more productive. Like quality game design, maybe.
This is RabbidLuigi, and it kind of blows my mind that Cooking Mama Cookstar made so many headlines because previous games have been relatively casual affairs where you do a bit of cooking and through some mini games you might learn something, the game might think that it's teaching you something. But Cooking Mama Cookstar made headlines because it might be using your Switch to mine cryptocurrency. I mean, it wasn't true in the end, but I had to tell someone at the time to maybe not buy it because I wasn't all that sure if it was true or not, and frankly at that point it wouldn't have been surprising if it was true. Only 2020 had stories like that.